It's 3 in the morning and the baggage carousel still hums. Gate C14 is empty, except for a janitor pushing a floor buffer in slow, methodical circles. The machines whir, echoing off walls that won't see passengers for another 2 hours. The fluorescent lights overhead flicker once, twice, then hold steady. Outside, on the tarmac, a lone fuel truck crosses beneath a sodium vapor lamp, its headlights cutting through fog that shouldn't be there in July. Down in the tunnels, the automated train arrives at an empty platform, its doors opening to no one, closing on nothing, moving forward because that's what it was designed to do. Someone once believed that an airport this large could run with the precision of a watch, that human chaos could be managed through systems and schedules and the relentless application of efficiency. The question was whether efficiency could account for everything, or whether some part of the operation would always remain just beyond control. The field where nothing was supposed to grow. There was a time when the land south of Atlanta was considered worthless for anything except farming, and barely that. The soil was red clay, stubborn and unforgiving. In the early 1920s, a racetrack occupied part of the site, a place where people came to watch cars circle an oval track, raising dust that settled over everything within a mile. The track failed. A Coca-Cola magnate named Asa Candler bought the land in 1925 and tried to turn it into an airfield, a modest strip where barnstormers and mail planes could land. He called it Candler Field, though most people still thought of it as the place where the racetrack used to be. Atlanta wasn't supposed to need a major airport. It wasn't on the coast. It had no natural harbor. The city's primary advantage was railroads, lines that converged from multiple directions, making Atlanta a junction point for freight and passengers moving across the South. But railroads were losing ground to aviation, and city leaders understood that what had been true for trains might also be true for planes. A city positioned at the intersection of routes could become essential, could turn geography into economic power, could leverage connectivity into something larger than the sum of its parts. The airfield expanded slowly through the 30s and 40s, adding runways and hangars and a small terminal building that looked more like a bus station than a gateway to anywhere. During World War II, the military took over part of the field for training purposes, and the presence of uniformed personnel gave the place a temporary significance it hadn't possessed before. When the war ended, the city bought the land outright and renamed it Atlanta Municipal Airport, a gesture toward civic ambition that the facility itself didn't yet justify. It was just another regional airport, smaller than those in New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, serving a city that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. But something was shifting beneath the surface, something that had less to do with aviation than with demographics and politics, and the particular way Atlanta positioned itself during the civil rights movement. While other southern cities resisted integration violently, Atlanta's leadership adopted what they called a more pragmatic approach, allowing desegregation to proceed without the riots and bombings that scarred Birmingham and Montgomery. This earned Atlanta a reputation as the city too busy to hate, a slogan that was part aspiration and part marketing. It attracted businesses looking to expand in the South without the baggage of overt racism, though the reality beneath the slogan was considerably more complicated. The airport benefited from this reputation. Airlines looking for a southern hub considered Atlanta because the city presented itself as modern and forward-looking, as a place that wouldn't embarrass corporate headquarters or alienate passengers. By the late 50s, the airport was handling more traffic than its facilities could comfortably accommodate, and that created both a problem and an opportunity. The problem was infrastructure. The opportunity was to build something ambitious, something that would cement Atlanta's position not just as a regional hub, but as a national one. Some believed the city was overreaching, trying to compete with airports in cities twice its size, investing in capacity that would never be filled. Others saw the expansion as visionary, as understanding that infrastructure creates demand rather than just responding to it. The debate was never fully resolved because by the time the new terminal opened in 1961, the traffic had already exceeded projections. The airport that was supposed to be too big turned out to be barely large enough. The airline that bet everything on Atlanta, Delta Airlines, didn't start in Atlanta. The company began in 1924 as a crop dusting operation in Louisiana, spraying fields to combat boll weevils that were devastating cotton crops across the South. Passenger service came later, almost as an afterthought, and for years Delta was a small regional carrier, one of dozens competing for routes in an industry that was heavily regulated by the federal government. Airlines couldn't just fly wherever they wanted. They had to apply for routes, and the Civil Aeronautics Board decided who got permission to fly where, often based on criteria that had more to do with politics than economics. Delta moved its headquarters to Atlanta in 1941, a decision that seemed unremarkable at the time but would prove essential decades later. The company grew slowly through the 50s and 60s, acquiring other airlines, adding routes, expanding its fleet. But it remained a mid-tier carrier, nowhere near the size or influence of Pan Am or TWA or Eastern. What changed everything was deregulation. In 1978, President Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act, which eliminated the government's control over routes and fares. Airlines were suddenly free to fly wherever they could make money, and competition intensified overnight. Deregulation created winners and losers. Some airlines, unable to adapt to the new competitive environment, collapsed. Others thrived by identifying strategies that maximized efficiency and market share. Delta's strategy was the hub and spoke model, concentrating operations at a single airport and routing passengers through that hub to reach their final destinations. The model wasn't new, but Delta implemented it more aggressively than most competitors, making Atlanta the center of an expanding network that connected smaller cities across the Southeast to destinations nationwide and eventually worldwide. The logic was simple. If you lived in Birmingham or Charleston or Greensboro and wanted to fly anywhere, you probably had to go through Atlanta. If you were flying from New York to Miami or Dallas to Orlando, routing through Atlanta might add a connection but could save money and time compared to direct flights. The more routes Delta added, the more essential Atlanta became, and the more essential Atlanta became, the harder it was for competing airlines to justify their own hubs in the region. Delta didn't just use Atlanta, it shaped the airport's growth, influencing runway construction and terminal expansion and gate allocation in ways that reinforced its dominance. By the mid-80s, Delta controlled over 80% of the traffic at Hartsfield, a level of market concentration that would have been impossible under the old regulatory system. The airport and the airline became inseparable, each dependent on the other in ways that created enormous economic benefits and equally enormous risks. If Delta succeeded, Atlanta succeeded. If Delta stumbled, the airport and the regional economy would feel it immediately. The relationship was symbiotic, but it was also precarious, built on the assumption that growth would continue indefinitely, that demand would always outpace capacity, that nothing fundamental would change. Some believed this concentration of power was brilliant strategy, a model for how cities and airlines could work together to create competitive advantage. Others saw it as a vulnerability, a single point of failure that left Atlanta exposed to forces beyond its control. The question wasn't whether the model worked in the short term. The question was, what would happen when it didn't? The ramp tower and the illusion of control. From the outside, the ramp tower looks like any other airport building, a concrete and glass structure with narrow windows and minimal decoration. But inside, the atmosphere is different. charged with a particular kind of intensity that comes from managing operations where every minute counts and every mistake cascades. Controllers sit in rows facing enormous windows that overlook 60 gates simultaneously, their desks covered in computer screens and radios and printouts that track every aircraft, every delay, every resource deployed across the operation. The noise is constant, voices overlapping, radios crackling, the underlying hum of systems working at capacity. Each controller manages multiple gates at once, coordinating between ground crews and flight crews, and caterers and fuelers and baggage handlers, ensuring that aircraft turn around as quickly as possible. Speed is everything. An aircraft sitting at a gate is an aircraft not making money, and airlines measure turnaround time in minutes, tracking performance obsessively, pushing ground crews to work faster without compromising safety. The tension between speed and safety is always present, never fully resolved, managed through procedures and training and the constant vigilance of people who understand that complacency kills. The controllers have information on everything: fuel requirements, passenger counts, baggage totals, maintenance issues, weather forecasts, crew availability. They know which flights are running late and why. They know which aircraft have mechanical problems. They know which gates are about to open up and which are blocked by delays elsewhere in the system. This information gives them power, but it also gives them responsibility. When something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong, it's their job to fix it, to find the spare aircraft, or reroute the passengers, or delay one flight to protect 10 others. The decisions are constant, relentless, made in seconds with incomplete information and consequences that ripple across the network. But for all the technology and information and coordination, the ramp tower operates on an uncomfortable truth. They don't actually control anything. They can't make weather disappear. They can't prevent mechanical failures. They can't speed up TSA lines or force connecting passengers to move faster through the terminals. What they can do is respond, adapt, improvise, using resources they have to minimize problems they can't prevent. It's crisis management disguised as routine operation, and the fact that it works most of the time doesn't change the underlying reality that the system is always one disruption away from chaos. Some believe the ramp tower represents the pinnacle of operational efficiency, proof that human judgment combined with technology can manage extraordinary complexity. Others see it as evidence of a system pushed beyond its limits, held together by people working impossibly hard to compensate for infrastructure that should have been upgraded years ago. Both views acknowledge that the operation depends on individuals making split-second decisions that the system wasn't designed to require, that efficiency at this scale creates fragility, that optimization and resilience exist in tension that's never quite resolved. Another explanation suggests that the ramp tower isn't about control at all, but about the illusion of control, about creating the appearance of order in an environment that's fundamentally chaotic. Maybe the controllers know this. Maybe that's why they keep working anyway, because someone has to, because the alternative is admitting that the system only works when everything goes right, and everything almost never goes right. The numbers that make it incomprehensible. By 2019, before the pandemic temporarily reduced traffic, Hartsfield-Jackson was processing 107 million passengers annually, more than any other airport in the world. That averages to 293,000 passengers per day, 12,000 per hour, 200 per minute. The airport operated 2,700 flights daily across 5 parallel runways, managing takeoffs and landings at a rate approaching 250 operations per hour during peak periods. The airfield covered 4,700 acres, requiring 96 miles of paved surface just for runways, taxiways, and aprons. The physical infrastructure employed 63,000 people directly, making the airport one of the largest single-site employers in Georgia. Another estimated 250,000 jobs in the metro Atlanta area depended on airport-related economic activity, from hotels and restaurants to logistics companies and corporate offices. The airport's annual economic impact on the region exceeded $70 billion, a figure that represents roughly 15% of the entire state's economy. Cargo operations moved over 700,000 tons of freight annually. Everything from overnight packages to automotive parts to flowers flown in from South America, processed through facilities that operated around the clock every day, regardless of weather or holidays. Passenger terminals contained 192 gates, spread across 7 concourses connected by an automated train system that moved over 250,000 people per day, operating trains every minute during peak hours, covering a 3-mile loop that ran continuously from 5 in the morning until 1 the following morning. The baggage system included 35 miles of conveyor belts, processing over 95,000 checked bags daily through a network of scanners and sorters and routing junctions that read RFID tags at multiple checkpoints, tracking each bag's location in real time to minimize the 2% that inevitably went missing. The airport consumed enough electricity to power a city of 100,000 people, generated by a central utility plant that produced over 120 million BTUs per hour for heating and cooling. The fuel farm stored 42 million gallons of jet fuel, distributed through underground pipes to every gate, pumping 11 million gallons per day during summer peak season. Water and waste systems handled flows equivalent to a small city, processing sewage and storm runoff and potable water for restaurants and bathrooms, and the fire suppression systems required by code. The airport operated its own police force, over 200 officers responsible for security across the entire property, and its own fire department, with stations positioned to reach any point on the airfield within 3 minutes. These numbers are supposed to demonstrate scale, to prove that the airport works, that Atlanta succeeded in building something extraordinary. But numbers can also reveal strain. 107 million passengers means terminals designed for less are handling more. 250 operations per hour means runways operating at theoretical maximum capacity. 63,000 employees means labor issues that affect thousands of flights. 42 million gallons of fuel means vulnerability to price shocks and supply disruptions. Every number that shows success also hints at fragility, at systems running constantly at the edge of what they were designed to handle. Some look at these numbers and see achievement, proof that Atlanta did something remarkable, that a city in the South with no natural advantages managed to build the busiest airport in the world. Others see warning signs, evidence that growth exceeded infrastructure, that the airport succeeded despite itself rather than because of careful planning. The numbers don't resolve the question. They just make it larger, harder to ignore, impossible to dismiss as anything other than what it is. An operation of staggering scale, held together by people working constantly to prevent the collapse that the numbers suggest is inevitable. The train that never stops running. The plane train wasn't part of the original airport design. When the new terminal opened in 1961, passengers walked between concourses or took buses that ran on access roads behind the terminals. As traffic grew and additional concourses were added, the distances became unmanageable. Passengers with tight connections missed flights. Elderly and disabled travelers struggled with the distances. The airport needed a solution that could move enormous numbers of people quickly across distances that kept expanding as the airport grew. The automated people mover opened in 1980, a 3-mile loop of track connecting all the concourses to the main terminal, running underground to avoid conflicts with aircraft and ground vehicles. The system was state-of-the-art for its time, using driverless trains controlled by computers, operating on a fixed schedule that could be adjusted based on passenger demand. During peak hours, trains run every minute, each car capable of holding over 70 passengers, creating a throughput that would be impossible with buses or moving walkways. But automation creates dependencies. The train has to work. There's no backup system, no alternative that can handle 250,000 passengers per day. When the train breaks down, even briefly, the effects ripple instantly. Passengers pile up on platforms, connections are missed, gates become inaccessible. The airport, for all its redundancy and backup systems, has a single point of failure that everyone hopes never fails, but knows eventually will. Engineers monitor the system constantly from a control room, watching screens that display every train's location and speed and door status, ready to dispatch repair crews the moment an alarm sounds. The pressure on the maintenance team is extraordinary. They work overnight when passenger traffic is lowest, inspecting track and wheels and doors and the automated switching systems that route trains correctly. They replace worn components before they fail. They test backup power systems. They drill scenarios, practicing responses to failures that haven't happened yet, but that they know are possible. The goal is never to let a train break down during operating hours, but that goal is aspirational, unrealistic, impossible to maintain indefinitely when equipment runs continuously for 20 hours a day, 365 days a year. When failures do occur, the response is immediate. Repair crews mobilize. The control room redirects passengers. Gate agents make announcements. The operation shifts into crisis mode, everyone working to restore service before the delays become catastrophic. Most failures are resolved quickly. Doors that won't close properly, minor electrical issues, software glitches that reset with a reboot. But occasionally something larger breaks, requiring hours of repair work during which the airport operates at reduced capacity, flights delayed, passengers stranded, the entire operation grinding down because one system failed. Some believe the train represents engineering excellence, a system that moves hundreds of thousands of people reliably despite impossible demands. Others see it as a warning, proof that the airport's dependence on a single transportation system is a design flaw that's never been adequately addressed. Both perspectives acknowledge that the train works until it doesn't, that reliability is measured in percentages that sound impressive until you multiply them by the number of passengers affected, that the difference between success and failure is often just a door that won't close, a wheel bearing that seizes, a software bug that crashes the control system. Another explanation suggests that the train's vulnerability is accepted because the alternative would be worse, that walking distances or bus systems would create even larger problems, that the airport has made a calculated bet that the train will work often enough to justify the risk of the times it doesn't. Maybe that bet is rational. Maybe it's just the least bad option. Or maybe it's evidence that airports this large shouldn't exist at all, that scale creates problems that can't be solved, only managed, and that management only works until it fails. The bags that vanish into infrastructure. 20 million bags disappear worldwide every year, and a significant percentage of those pass through Atlanta at some point. The number sounds catastrophic until you realize it represents less than 1% of all checked luggage. But for the passengers whose bags are missing, the statistics don't matter. The bag that's gone is their bag, containing their possessions, their medications, their wedding dress or business presentation, or irreplaceable family photographs. The baggage system's job is to prevent that loss, to ensure that every bag checked at a ticket counter arrives at the correct carousel at the destination airport, passing through multiple screening and sorting steps without error. Atlanta's baggage system is a marvel of automation. 35 miles of conveyor belts, moving bags through the building's basement and underground tunnels at speeds up to 20 feet per second, routing them to the correct flight based on RFID tags that are scanned at multiple checkpoints. The system can process 95,000 bags per day, reading tags even when barcodes are damaged or obscured, tracking each bag's location in real time, alerting staff when a bag is about to miss its connection or gets routed incorrectly. The technology is sophisticated, expensive, and essential because the alternative manual sorting would require thousands of additional workers and would still generate higher error rates. But automation also creates opacity. Once a bag enters the system, passengers can't see it, can't verify it's going to the right place, can't intervene if something goes wrong. The bag becomes data, a blip on a screen, an entry in a database that may or may not correspond to the physical object moving through the tunnels below. Most of the time, the system works. The bag arrives, the passenger collects it. The technology fulfilled its purpose invisibly, efficiently, exactly as designed. But when the system fails, when the bag doesn't arrive, passengers are left with no information beyond "we're looking for it," a response that offers no comfort and little hope. The reasons bags go missing are varied. Tags get torn off in transit. Bags are loaded onto the wrong flight. Mechanical jams cause bags to be diverted to manual sorting areas where they sit until someone notices. Connecting flights leave before bags can be transferred. Security screening flags a bag for additional inspection, delaying it past its departure time. Each failure has a cause, but identifying the cause doesn't help the passenger who's arriving in a different city without their luggage, who's forced to buy clothes and toiletries and hope the bag eventually shows up. Behind the scenes, an entire department exists, solely to track and reunite lost bags with their owners, using databases and phone calls and sometimes just intuition to figure out where a bag ended up and how to get it to its intended destination. The work is unglamorous, frustrating, repetitive, and occasionally rewarding when a bag that seemed permanently lost is located and returned. But it's also evidence of system failure, proof that, despite all the technology and automation and tracking, bags still vanish with regularity that's considered acceptable by airlines but feels personal to passengers. Some believe lost baggage is an inevitable cost of air travel at scale, that moving millions of bags through complex systems will always generate errors, that the real achievement is keeping the loss rate as low as it is. Others see it as a failure of design, evidence that airports prioritized speed over accuracy, that automation was implemented before the technology was reliable, that passengers bear the cost of system failures they didn't cause and can't prevent. Both views acknowledge that the baggage system works remarkably well most of the time, and that most of the time isn't good enough when it's your bag that's missing. The people who work while passengers sleep. At 3 in the morning, the airport is both empty and full. Passenger gates are deserted, their seating areas dark, their jetways retracted. Restaurants are closed, metal gates pulled down over storefronts, lights off except for security fixtures required by code. But underneath and behind this visible emptiness, another airport operates, one that most passengers never see and rarely think about. This is when the maintenance crews take over, when the cleaning staff descends, when the engineers and technicians do the work that keeps the systems functioning. The overnight shift is different. The pressure is lower, but the stakes are the same. Everything has to be ready by 6 in the morning when the first waves of passengers arrive, when the gates reopen and the flights resume and the airport transitions from maintenance mode back to operational tempo. This means miles of floors must be cleaned, thousands of toilets scrubbed, hundreds of trash receptacles emptied. It means escalators must be inspected, elevators tested, moving walkways cleaned and checked for mechanical issues. It means runway lights must be examined, taxiway markings repainted, drainage systems cleared of debris. The people who do this work are largely invisible. Passengers see clean floors and functioning escalators and take them for granted, unaware that an army of workers moved through the building overnight to create that appearance of normalcy. The pay is modest. The hours are difficult. The work is physically demanding and often thankless, performed in empty terminals under fluorescent lights, with supervisors tracking productivity and completion times. Many of these workers are immigrants, people for whom this job represents a foothold in America, an income that can support a family, a stepping stone to something better, even if that something better never arrives. The invisibility is structural. Overnight workers are scheduled specifically to avoid passengers, to complete their tasks before the airport reopens, to disappear before the public sees them. This creates efficiency, allows work to be done without disrupting operations, but it also reinforces a hierarchy where certain labor is valued and certain labor is not, where the people who make the airport function are treated as interchangeable rather than essential. Unions have fought for better wages and conditions, with mixed results. Turnover is high, injuries are common. The work continues because it must, because someone has to do it, because the airport can't operate without clean floors and functioning systems, even if no one wants to think about who provides them. Some believe this is just how labor markets work, that overnight cleaning and maintenance jobs will always be low wage, because the skills required are minimal and the labor pool is large. Others see it as exploitation, evidence that the airport's economic success is built on the backs of workers who share little of the prosperity they help create, that the billions of dollars in economic impact don't trickle down to the people mopping floors at 4 a.m. Both perspectives acknowledge that the work is essential, that without these overnight crews the airport would cease to function, and that essential work and valued work are not the same thing. Another explanation focuses less on economics and more on visibility, on the fact that we don't value what we don't see, that labor performed out of sight becomes easy to ignore, that the airport's obsession with passenger experience creates a corresponding indifference to worker experience. Maybe that's deliberate. Maybe creating a seamless passenger experience requires hiding the labor that produces it. Or maybe it's just easier not to think about who cleans the toilets and where they go when their shift ends, and whether they can afford to live anywhere near the airport where they work. The security theater that became real. Before September 11, 2001, airport security was minimal. Passengers could arrive 30 minutes before departure, walk directly to their gate without screening, say goodbye to family members at the aircraft door. Security checkpoints existed but were cursory, focused primarily on preventing hijackings, which were understood to be hostage situations where cooperation increased survival chances. The aviation security paradigm assumed that threats were external, that aircraft would be targeted by criminals or political extremists, but that the goal would be ransom or negotiation, not mass casualty attacks. That assumption ended on a Tuesday morning when 19 hijackers turned 4 commercial aircraft into weapons, killing nearly 3,000 people and transforming American aviation security permanently. The response was immediate and sweeping. Within 2 months, Congress passed legislation creating the Transportation Security Administration, federalizing airport security, implementing new screening procedures that assumed every passenger was a potential threat until proven otherwise. The changes were meant to restore confidence in air travel, to demonstrate that the government had taken action, to prevent future attacks through vigilance and technology and the visible performance of security. At Atlanta, as at every major airport, the transformation was dramatic. Security checkpoints expanded, requiring passengers to remove shoes and belts, to separate laptops and liquids, to submit to body scanners that produced images some considered invasive. Wait times increased. Prohibited items multiplied. The list of things you couldn't bring through security grew longer and more arbitrary, including items like snow globes and large bottles of shampoo that posed no conceivable threat, but were banned anyway because rules required bright lines and couldn't account for nuance or common sense. The expansion of security created thousands of new jobs, paying wages that were better than overnight cleaning but still modest, requiring workers to stand for hours screening passengers, many of whom were frustrated, confused, or outright hostile about the process. TSA agents became the face of post-9/11 security, blamed for delays and inconvenience, even though they were implementing policies created by people far above their pay grade. The work was repetitive, stressful, and occasionally dangerous when passengers became confrontational or when actual threats were discovered, which happened rarely enough to make vigilance difficult, but often enough to make complacency deadly. But the real question, the one that's never been satisfactorily answered, is whether any of this actually makes flying safer. TSA regularly fails tests conducted by internal auditors, missing high percentages of weapons and explosives smuggled through checkpoints by investigators. The security theater critics argue that the elaborate screening is precisely that. Theater, a performance meant to reassure the public rather than actually prevent attacks, that dedicated terrorists could still smuggle weapons aboard if they were determined and creative. That the real security improvements came from reinforced cockpit doors and passenger awareness rather than confiscating water bottles and nail clippers. Others maintain that security is working, that the absence of successful attacks on U.S. commercial aviation since 2001 proves the system's effectiveness, that the visible presence of security deters potential threats, even if it doesn't catch everything. The debate is impossible to resolve because we can't know what attacks were prevented, what threats were deterred, whether the security measures are effective, or whether we've just been lucky for 2 decades. The uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it's also permanent because security is ultimately about preventing things that don't happen, and proving a negative is impossible. Another explanation suggests that the real purpose of TSA isn't security, but liability management, that airlines and airports and governments need to be seen taking security seriously regardless of effectiveness, that the performance of vigilance matters more than actual vigilance because the consequences of another attack would be catastrophic for everyone involved. Maybe that's cynical, or maybe it's realistic. Maybe security theater and real security aren't as different as we think. Maybe the appearance of protection creates psychological effects that matter even if the physical protection is incomplete. The question isn't whether the system is perfect. The question is whether it's better than nothing, and no one can answer that with certainty. The wildlife problem that never ends. Birds don't respect airport boundaries. They see the airfield as habitat, a large open space with minimal human disturbance, plenty of grass and insects, occasional standing water that attracts prey species. To birds, the runways and taxiways are just another landscape, indistinguishable from fields or meadows, except for the occasional loud machines that come and go. The problem, of course, is that those machines are aircraft, and collisions between birds and planes can be catastrophic. Engines are designed to ingest air, not solid objects, and a bird strike can destroy turbine blades, cause fires, force emergency landings, kill people. The most famous bird strike was U.S. Airways Flight 1549 In 2009, the miracle on the Hudson, when a flock of Canada geese disabled both engines shortly after takeoff from LaGuardia, forcing Captain Sullenberger to ditch in the river. Everyone survived, but the incident highlighted how vulnerable aircraft are during takeoff and landing, when they're low and slow and have limited options if something goes wrong. Bird strikes aren't rare. They happen constantly, thousands per year across all U.S. airports, usually causing minor damage but occasionally resulting in crashes that kill everyone aboard. Atlanta's wildlife management program exists to minimize this risk, using a combination of habitat modification, harassment techniques, and when necessary, lethal removal to keep birds and other animals away from aircraft. The work is constant, unglamorous, and impossible to complete. You can't eliminate wildlife from 5,000 acres of open space. You can only manage it, discourage it, make the airport less attractive than surrounding areas, and hope the animals find somewhere else to go. But hope isn't a strategy, and the wildlife always returns, because the habitat is too good, the food sources too abundant, the open space too attractive. The tools available to the wildlife team range from simple to sophisticated. Pyrotechnics that make loud noises and bright flashes, startling birds into flight. Propane cannons that fire periodically throughout the day, creating unpredictable sounds that prevent habituation. Bioacoustic systems that play distress calls of specific species, triggering instinctive flee responses. Falconry using trained raptors to patrol the airfield, their presence alone enough to discourage smaller birds from landing. Each technique works for a while, until the birds adapt, learn that the noises aren't actually dangerous, return and resume their activities as if nothing had changed. When harassment fails, the team must sometimes kill. Shooting birds isn't something anyone enjoys, but it's sometimes necessary when specific individuals repeatedly return to high-risk areas despite all deterrence efforts. The kills are documented, the remains collected, and sent to laboratories for DNA analysis that helps identify patterns, determine what's attracting certain species, inform modifications to habitat or drainage, or maintenance practices that might reduce future risks. It's scientific, methodical, evidence-based, and still fundamentally reactive, responding to problems rather than preventing them. Some believe wildlife management is essential, that the risks of bird strikes justify the costs and effort required to minimize them, that passengers have a right to expect that everything possible is being done to make flying safe. Others see it as a doomed effort, trying to impose human control on natural systems that don't recognize boundaries or respond to deterrence, that building airports in the middle of bird migration routes or near wetlands creates conflicts that can be managed but never resolved. Both views acknowledge that the problem is permanent, that as long as aircraft and birds share airspace, collisions will occur, that the question isn't whether strikes can be eliminated, but whether they can be reduced enough to prevent catastrophic failures. Another explanation suggests that bird strikes are less a wildlife problem than an engineering problem, that aircraft engines could be designed more robustly, that redundancy could be increased, that the vulnerability of turbine blades to damage from relatively small impacts reveals design limitations we've accepted rather than solved. Maybe that's true. Maybe engines designed to maximize fuel efficiency will always be fragile. Or maybe we've just decided that rare catastrophic failures are acceptable losses, costs of doing business in an industry where perfect safety is impossible and every improvement has diminishing returns. The mechanics who keep machines flying. Aircraft don't break on a schedule. They break when components fail, when systems degrade, when metal fatigues or sensors malfunction or software encounters conditions programmers didn't anticipate. A plane that arrives perfectly functional in the morning might develop hydraulic issues by afternoon. a cracked windshield by evening, an engine problem overnight. Each issue must be diagnosed, repaired, documented, inspected, signed off by certified mechanics before the aircraft can return to service. The timeline is always urgent because aircraft generate revenue only when flying, and every hour on the ground is an hour of lost income. Delta's maintenance facility at Atlanta is one of the largest in the world, capable of performing everything from routine inspections to complete engine overhauls to structural repairs that require disassembling significant portions of the aircraft. The building itself is massive, big enough to house multiple wide-body jets simultaneously, with specialized equipment for every conceivable repair task. The work is precise, demanding, often physically difficult, performed by mechanics who've spent years learning their trade, who understand that lives depend on their attention to detail, that cutting corners or missing a defect can kill people. The pressure is extraordinary. Airlines schedule maintenance during overnight hours to minimize impact on operations, which means mechanics work when most people sleep, under time constraints that make every job feel rushed even when it isn't. The work requires both technical knowledge and practical judgment, the ability to diagnose problems that don't present obvious symptoms, to determine whether a component needs replacing or can be serviced, to balance competing demands of safety and cost and schedule. Mistakes happen despite extensive training and oversight, because humans are fallible and systems are complex, and sometimes problems hide in ways that even experienced mechanics miss. But mechanics also catch things, find issues that sensors didn't detect, notice anomalies that prevent future failures, exercise judgment that prevents incidents that never happen and therefore never get credited. The work is essential but invisible, appreciated only when it fails, taken for granted when it succeeds. This creates a particular psychology among maintenance crews, a combination of pride and frustration, satisfaction in doing skilled work, and resentment that few people understand what they do or why it matters. They keep flying safe, but passengers boarding those aircraft rarely think about the mechanics who inspected them, who replaced worn parts, who signed off that the plane was airworthy. The parts required for repairs come from an enormous warehouse, 1 million square feet of storage containing components for every aircraft type in Delta's fleet. The inventory is managed by sophisticated computer systems that track every part's location, predict when components will need replacing based on usage patterns, automatically reorder items before stock runs out. But automation only works when the systems are accurate, when parts are returned to correct locations, when inventory counts match reality. The warehouse employs hundreds of people whose job is maintaining that accuracy, ensuring that when a mechanic orders a part at 3 in the morning, it's available and functional and delivered to the right maintenance bay within minutes. Some believe Delta's investment in maintenance facilities and trained mechanics is what separates successful airlines from failures. That reliability comes from taking maintenance seriously, from having redundancy and expertise and resources available whenever needed. Others point out that maintenance is expensive, that every dollar spent on facilities and labor is a dollar not available for other purposes, that airlines constantly face pressure to cut costs, and that maintenance is always vulnerable when executives look for savings. Both perspectives acknowledge that aircraft maintenance exists in tension between safety and economics, that the question isn't whether maintenance matters but how much is enough, and that enough is a judgment call that's always made in retrospect, after the accident that could have been prevented, or the non-accident that justified the expense. Another explanation suggests that maintenance mechanics occupy a strange position in aviation, simultaneously essential and disposable, highly skilled but replaceable, trusted with lives but paid less than pilots or even some gate agents. Maybe that reflects market forces, supply and demand for labor with specific certifications. Or maybe it reflects something darker about which jobs we value, which labor we honor, which workers we remember when things go right versus when things go wrong. The delays that compound into chaos. Weather doesn't respect schedules. Thunderstorms form over Atlanta with little warning during summer months, towering cumulonimbus clouds that produce lightning, high winds, heavy rain, and hail. When lightning is detected within a certain radius of the airport, ground operations must cease. Fueling stops, baggage loading halts, ground crews retreat to safety, aircraft sit at gates, passengers loaded, waiting for clearance that may not come for an hour or longer. Each minute of delay compounds, spreading through the network as crews time out, gates become unavailable, connecting passengers miss flights, aircraft end up in wrong cities at the end of the day. The ramp tower controllers watch radar screens, tracking storm cells, making calculations about whether to hold aircraft or let them push back, gambling on windows between storms that might or might not materialize. The decisions are impossible. Release an aircraft too early and it might be forced to return to the gate. Hold it too long and the delay spreads, affecting flights hours later, creating problems that persist into the next day. There's no right answer, just choices that seem reasonable at the time and prove wrong in retrospect. And controllers learn to live with second-guessing themselves, wondering if different decisions would have produced better outcomes. But weather is only one source of delay. Mechanical issues ground aircraft unexpectedly. Security incidents close checkpoints. Medical emergencies require unscheduled landings. Air traffic control manages too many aircraft through too little airspace, with tools that haven't been updated in decades. Each problem cascades. A delay in Atlanta affects departures in Chicago, arrivals in Miami, connections in Boston. The network is interconnected in ways that magnify disruptions, that turn local problems into system-wide failures that mean a thunderstorm over Georgia can cause missed meetings in California and ruined vacations in Europe. Passengers experience these delays as frustrating inconveniences, hours spent in uncomfortable chairs eating overpriced food, missing events they planned for months, arriving exhausted at destinations where they're already behind schedule. What they don't see is the frantic work happening behind the scenes. Controllers rearranging flights, mechanics rushing repairs, gate agents rebooking hundreds of passengers, cleaning crews preparing aircraft faster than safety margins should allow. The system absorbs enormous stress to minimize delays, people working overtime without compensation, procedures bent to keep operations moving, shortcuts taken that probably shouldn't be, but that seem necessary in the moment. Some believe delays are inevitable at airports this busy, that operating at capacity means any disruption creates backlog, that the real achievement is recovering as quickly as Atlanta usually does. Others argue that the frequency of delays proves the airport is over capacity, that infrastructure hasn't kept pace with traffic, that airlines schedule more flights than can reliably operate because full planes are profitable even if they're late. Both views acknowledge that passengers bear the cost of a system optimized for efficiency during perfect conditions, that weather and mechanical issues and all the other disruptions are treated as anomalies, even though they're routine, predictable, built into the operation as surely as runways and terminals. Another explanation suggests that delays serve a function, that they're how the system communicates. It's stressed, that if delays didn't exist, the operation would simply fail. Aircraft would run out of fuel waiting for gates. Crews would exceed duty limits with no replacements available, the entire network would freeze. Maybe delays are the pressure relief valve, the mechanism that prevents total collapse by spreading pain across thousands of passengers instead of concentrating it in catastrophic failure. Or maybe that's rationalization, making virtue of necessity, pretending that system limitations are features rather than bugs. The air traffic controllers, watching everything. The tower sits above the airport like a lighthouse, walls of windows providing 360-degree views of runways and taxiways, and the aircraft moving between them. Inside, controllers sit at consoles, headsets on, voices calm, managing the constant flow of departures and arrivals that make Atlanta the busiest airport in the world. The work requires intense concentration, spatial awareness, the ability to track dozens of aircraft simultaneously while maintaining required separation, ensuring no two planes occupy the same space at the same time. The consequences of error are catastrophic, measured in hundreds of lives, careers destroyed, investigations that dissect every decision. Atlanta's airspace is some of the most complex in the United States. 5 parallel runways operating simultaneously, aircraft arriving from all directions, departures climbing through corridors shared with arrivals. The whole operation coordinated through procedures refined over decades, but never quite perfected. Controllers manage this complexity through strict protocols, standardized phraseology, redundant checks that verify clearances, and catch mistakes before they become accidents. But protocols only work if everyone follows them, if pilots read back clearances correctly, if controllers catch errors, if the technology functions as designed. The technology is both sophisticated and dated. Radar tracks aircraft, displaying their positions on screens that look modern but run on systems designed in the 1980s, updated periodically but never fully replaced because the cost and risk of overhauling air traffic control infrastructure while it's in continuous use is enormous. The controllers work with what they have, compensating for system limitations through experience and judgment, maintaining mental pictures of traffic flows that supplement the information on their screens, listening to other controllers' transmissions to build awareness of what's happening in adjacent sectors. The job is stressful in ways that aren't obvious from outside. Controllers are responsible for safety, but don't control all the variables. Weather changes unpredictably. Pilots make mistakes. Aircraft have mechanical problems. Other controllers in other facilities make decisions that affect Atlanta's airspace. The pressure is constant, mitigated by procedures and training, but never eliminated. And controllers cope by developing detachment, focusing on the technical aspects of the work rather than thinking about the hundreds of people aboard each aircraft they're managing. It's necessary detachment, protective, but it also creates distance between controllers and the consequences of their decisions. Some believe air traffic control at Atlanta represents the pinnacle of professional excellence, controllers managing impossible complexity with remarkable safety records, preventing accidents that would otherwise be inevitable given the volume of traffic. Others worry that the system operates too close to its limits, that controllers are managing more aircraft with older technology than is prudent, that the absence of major accidents reflects luck as much as skill, that eventually the odds will catch up. Both perspectives acknowledge that air traffic control is essential infrastructure that's chronically underfunded, staffed by professionals who are overworked and underpaid, operating systems that should have been replaced years ago but weren't, because Congress wouldn't appropriate the money. Another explanation suggests that air traffic control works despite itself, that the system survives because controllers are good at their jobs, despite the constraints they work under, that safety is maintained through human expertise compensating for institutional failures. Maybe that's sustainable. Maybe skilled people can keep managing increasing complexity indefinitely. Or maybe there's a limit, a point where volume exceeds capacity in ways that can't be managed through skill alone, where the system breaks not because anyone made a mistake, but because the task became impossible. The hidden cost of being the busiest. Atlanta's status as the world's busiest airport is a source of civic pride, proof that the city matters globally, that investment in infrastructure paid off, that strategy and execution created something remarkable. Politicians cite the airport in economic development pitches. Business leaders point to it as evidence of Atlanta's importance. Residents complain about it, but also rely on it. The connectivity it provides, the jobs it creates, the identity it confers. Being the busiest means something, suggests success, validates decisions made decades ago by people who bet that building capacity would create demand. But being the busiest also means operating constantly at the edge of what's manageable, where any disruption cascades, where systems designed for peak capacity have no slack for problems that inevitably occur. It means terminals that feel crowded even during off-peak hours. It means security lines that stretch through concourses. It means delayed flights and missed connections, and passengers sleeping on floors when weather or mechanical issues strand them overnight. The efficiency that makes high volume possible also makes the experience of moving through the airport often unpleasant, stressful, exhausting. For workers, being the busiest means relentless pressure, schedules that allow no downtime, expectations that everything runs perfectly, even though perfection is impossible. Ramp controllers manage more gates simultaneously than controllers at smaller airports. Mechanics rush repairs to meet turnaround times. TSA agents screen endless lines of passengers. Gate agents rebook hundreds of people when flights cancel. The work is never done because there's always another plane arriving, another departure boarding, another problem requiring immediate attention. Burnout is common, turnover is high, the airport burns through people, extracting their labor and replacing them when they can't sustain the pace. The economic benefits are real but unevenly distributed. The airport generates billions in economic impact, but much of that flows to airlines, concessionaires, corporate headquarters located elsewhere. Workers at the airport earn wages that often don't cover the cost of living in Atlanta's increasingly expensive metro area. The 63,000 jobs the airport provides are essential, but many are low-wage service positions with minimal benefits, the kind of work that keeps people employed but not financially secure, that provides income but not prosperity, that creates economic activity without building wealth for the people creating it. Some believe this is acceptable, that airports create value in multiple ways, that even modest jobs are better than no jobs, that the alternative to being the busiest would be economic stagnation and decline. Others argue that Atlanta could be the busiest and also provide better wages, better working conditions, better distribution of the wealth generated by airport operations, that the current model extracts value from workers while providing minimal compensation, that being essential and being valued are different things, and the gap between them is where exploitation lives. Another explanation suggests that being the busiest was never about prosperity for everyone, that it was about competitive advantage for Delta and economic positioning for Atlanta as a city, that workers were always meant to be inputs rather than beneficiaries, that the success of the airport as measured by passenger volume and economic impact says nothing about the success of the people who make that volume possible. Maybe that's too cynical. Or maybe it's accurate, a clear-eyed assessment of whose interests the airport serves and whose interests it consumes. The pandemic that stopped everything. In March 2020, something unprecedented happened. The airport went quiet. Passenger traffic dropped 95% almost overnight as the pandemic shut down travel. Conferences canceled, vacations postponed, business trips deemed non-essential. The terminals, usually packed with travelers, were nearly empty. Flights that remained operated with handfuls of passengers in aircraft designed for hundreds. The airport that prided itself on constant motion, on being the busiest, suddenly wasn't busy at all, and no one knew when or if normal operations would return. For workers, the pandemic was catastrophic. Airlines furloughed tens of thousands of employees. Concessionaires closed stores and restaurants, laying off staff. TSA reduced screening lanes as traffic vanished. Cleaning crews had less to clean. Maintenance schedules stretched as aircraft sat parked for months. The airport that employed 63,000 people directly suddenly needed far fewer, and the people laid off faced a job market where travel industry experience was suddenly worthless, where unemployment benefits were overwhelmed, where the future was uncertain in ways it hadn't been since the Great Depression. The empty terminals were eerie, airports transformed into something resembling abandoned buildings, gates without aircraft, concourses without passengers, the infrastructure of mobility rendered useless by a virus that made travel dangerous. Some workers stayed, maintaining systems that had to function, even without passengers, keeping the airport ready for the eventual return of traffic. Others left, finding work elsewhere, or retiring, or simply waiting, hoping their jobs would eventually come back. The airport that never stopped suddenly had, and the silence was unsettling, wrong, a disruption to an order that everyone had assumed was permanent. Recovery came slowly, unevenly. Domestic leisure travel returned first, people desperate to escape lockdown, to visit family, to feel normal again, even if normal was still months or years away. Business travel lagged, companies discovering that virtual meetings worked adequately, that expensive trips to conferences and client meetings weren't always necessary, that travel could be reduced without destroying relationships or productivity. International travel remained depressed, complicated by changing entry requirements, quarantine rules, fear of being stranded abroad if infections surged. By 2023, passenger numbers had recovered to pre-pandemic levels. The airport once again processing over 100 million passengers annually, once again the busiest in the world. But the recovery masked changes that persisted. Airlines operated with smaller staffs, having discovered they could manage with fewer gate agents and flight attendants through automation and schedule adjustments. Concessionaires reopened with reduced hours and fewer employees. The airport looked similar to 2019 but functioned differently, leaner, more automated, less forgiving of disruptions. Some believe the pandemic proved the airport's resilience, its ability to adapt and recover. That traffic returning to previous levels demonstrated the enduring demand for air travel, that Atlanta's position as the busiest was secure, regardless of temporary disruptions. Others see the pandemic as having exposed vulnerabilities, revealed how quickly systems collapse when assumptions fail, how workers bore the cost of industry-wide failures they didn't cause, how recovery benefited airlines and airports while leaving workers in positions more precarious than before. Another explanation suggests that the pandemic was a rehearsal, a preview of what happens when systems designed for continuous operation are forced to stop, that the lessons learned about fragility and interdependence and the human cost of optimization have already been forgotten in the rush to restore efficiency, that the next disruption, whatever it is, will find the airport no more prepared than it was in March 2020, because the incentives that created vulnerability in the first place remain unchanged. The question that hovers over everything. There's a question no one at the airport wants to answer directly. Should an airport this busy exist at all? is operating at the edge of capacity, where any disruption creates cascading failures, where workers are pushed to their limits, where passengers experience constant stress, where systems have no margin for error. Is that success, or is it evidence of something broken? The airport works, mostly, but at what cost and to whose benefit, and whether the model is sustainable or just hasn't failed catastrophically yet? These questions hover, unasked in official settings, discussed quietly by workers who see the strain daily. Atlanta's position as the busiest depends on Delta's hub strategy, on routing passengers through connections rather than offering direct flights, on a model that prioritizes utilization over experience. For Delta, this makes economic sense. Hubs allow airlines to serve more destinations with fewer aircraft, to fill planes that would otherwise fly half empty, to extract maximum value from assets and infrastructure. For passengers, the model means connections where direct flights would be preferable, time spent in airports rather than at destinations, delays that compound because so many journeys depend on tight connections working perfectly. The alternative would be a different kind of airport, one designed for lower volume but higher quality experience, where terminals aren't constantly crowded, where workers have time to do their jobs without rushing, where delays don't cascade because there's capacity to absorb disruptions. But that alternative would be smaller, would handle fewer passengers, would generate less economic impact, would lose the status that comes with being the busiest. No one in Atlanta's leadership wants that, because smaller means less important, means other cities become the hub, means economic activity flows elsewhere. So the airport continues growing, adding gates and parking and terminal space, absorbing more traffic, pushing toward higher volumes that cement its position but also increase fragility. The question isn't whether growth will continue. The question is whether there's a limit, a point where the system becomes unmanageable, not because of any single failure, but because the complexity exceeds human and technological capacity to coordinate. That limit might not exist, or it might be closer than anyone wants to admit, hidden in the next pandemic or the next recession or the next technological failure, or simply in the accumulated stress of an operation that never quite has enough resources to do what it's trying to do. Some believe the airport will keep functioning indefinitely, that problems will be solved as they arise, that human ingenuity and technological advancement will continue increasing capacity and efficiency, that being the busiest is sustainable because it's been sustained so far. Others worry that sustainability is an illusion, that the airport operates successfully only because catastrophic failures are rare, that rare isn't the same as impossible, that eventually luck runs out. Both perspectives acknowledge that the airport exists in a state of managed crisis, that normal operations require extraordinary effort, that what looks like success from the outside feels like barely controlled chaos from the inside. Another explanation suggests that asking whether the airport should exist misses the point, that Atlanta is locked into a path dependency where the airport must remain the busiest or the city's economy suffers, where decades of investment and development have created obligations that can't be abandoned, where the question isn't about what should be but what has to be given decisions already made. Maybe that's fatalism, or maybe it's realism, accepting that some systems become too large to change, too essential to fail, too complicated to reimagine even when reimagining seems necessary. What happens in the spaces between shifts? It's 4 a.m. again. The overnight cleaning crews are finishing their rounds, loading equipment onto carts, preparing to clock out as the day shift arrives. In the plane train tunnels, engineers complete their inspections, noting items that need repair but can wait until the next overnight window. On the airfield, the last runway inspection finishes, the operations vehicle returning to its bay as dawn approaches. The airport transitions, one shift ending, another beginning, the handoff so smooth that passengers arriving for early flights won't notice the change. This is the rhythm that sustains the airport, the constant cycling of shifts, the accumulated labor of thousands of people working around the clock to maintain systems that must never stop. Each worker contributes a small part, a few hours of effort, specific tasks completed before the next person takes over. No one sees the whole operation. No one could. The scale is too large, the complexity too great, the interdependencies too numerous. What keeps it working is specialization, people becoming expert at narrow tasks, trusting that others are doing their jobs correctly even though they never meet, even though they wouldn't recognize each other if they passed in the terminal. But this fragmentation also creates vulnerability. When systems depend on thousands of people coordinating without direct communication, when knowledge is distributed so widely that no one person understands how everything fits together, when optimization means eliminating redundancy that might have caught errors, the operation becomes brittle. It works until it doesn't. The failure might be small, a single worker making a single mistake, but mistakes in complex systems rarely stay small. They propagate, interact with other factors, cascade into failures that seem disproportionate to their causes. The airport has procedures for everything, manuals that specify exactly how each task should be performed, checklists that must be completed before moving to the next step, oversight that's supposed to catch errors before they cause problems. But procedures assume conditions that don't always exist. They assume workers aren't fatigued from overtime or distracted by personal problems or rushing because they're understaffed. They assume equipment functions correctly, that technology doesn't glitch, that information is accurate and timely. When those assumptions fail, procedures fail too, and what remains is human judgment, making decisions in real time with incomplete information and inadequate time. Some believe the airport's resilience comes from its people, from workers who care about doing their jobs well, even when conditions are difficult, who take pride in keeping things running, who intervene when they see problems developing. Others worry that relying on worker dedication to compensate for systemic inadequacy is exploitation disguised as virtue, that expecting people to work harder to make up for insufficient resources is a management failure, not a source of pride. Both views acknowledge that the airport functions because people make it function, that the technology and procedures and infrastructure matter, but ultimately depend on humans doing unglamorous work under constant pressure. Another explanation suggests that what happens in the spaces between shifts is where the real airport exists, in the transitions that no one notices, in the labor that's invisible, in the maintenance that prevents failures rather than responding to them. Maybe that's where understanding should focus, not on the impressive statistics of passenger volume and flight operations, but on the mundane reality of people cleaning toilets and inspecting wiring and replacing worn parts, the essential work that makes everything else possible, but that gets mentioned only when it's not done. The morning that looks like every morning. The first passengers arrive before dawn, business travelers catching early flights, families beginning vacations, people moving through the airport with practiced efficiency or nervous uncertainty depending on how often they fly. The terminals wake up, lights coming on in concession areas, security checkpoints opening, gate agents arriving at podiums, the airport transitioning from maintenance mode to operational tempo. On the ramp, the first aircraft of the day push back from gates, engines starting, crews running through pre-flight checks, ground staff disconnecting air and power and waving goodbye. In the tower, controllers begin their shift, receiving briefings from the overnight staff, checking weather forecasts, noting aircraft already inbound from cities where dawn came earlier. The ramp tower controllers boot up their computers, check the day's schedule, identify potential problems before they develop. TSA agents take positions at checkpoints, testing equipment, preparing for the morning rush. Everywhere across the airport, the operation spins up, thousands of people and machines synchronizing, beginning another day identical to yesterday and the day before and the day that will follow. From above, the airport looks calm, organized, precisely choreographed. Aircraft taxi in orderly lines. Passengers flow through terminals along predictable paths. Everything seems to work, and mostly it does, but the appearance of calm conceals constant small crises, decisions made in seconds, problems solved before passengers notice, the continuous effort required to make the operation look effortless. This is what Atlanta has built, an airport that handles impossible volume through optimization that leaves no margin for error, that depends on everything working correctly because when things go wrong, they go wrong quickly. The woman in the mink coat from the beginning, standing in the terminal in 1963, believed she was in a place that represented the future. 6 decades later, the airport has grown beyond what she could have imagined, but whether it's become what anyone intended is unclear. The airport works, serves its purpose, moves millions of people, generates billions in economic impact. But it also exhausts its workers, frustrates its passengers, operates constantly at the edge of capacity, exists in a state of barely managed chaos that's normalized as success because the alternative is admitting the model might be flawed. Some believe the airport's story is one of triumph, of a city that built something extraordinary through vision and investment and determination, that Atlanta's rise from regional obscurity to global significance is embodied in Hartsfield-Jackson, that being the busiest proves the strategy worked. Others see a different story, one where growth exceeded wisdom, where ambition outpaced capability, where the pursuit of volume and status created an operation that serves some interests extremely well and others hardly at all, where efficiency and humanity exist in tension that's never resolved. Another explanation suggests that both stories are true simultaneously, that the airport is both achievement and warning, proof that building large-scale systems is possible, and evidence that doing so creates problems that can't be fully solved, only managed. Maybe airports at this scale shouldn't exist. Maybe they're inevitable. Maybe the question isn't whether the model works, but whether we have any choice now that it's built, now that millions of journeys and thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in economic activity depend on it continuing. The morning proceeds. Flights depart on time mostly, passengers reach their destinations eventually, the systems function barely, the workers show up again. The airport that never stops running continues not stopping, because stopping isn't an option, because too much depends on it, because the question of whether it should exist has been replaced by the reality that it does. And somewhere in the terminal, another janitor pushes another floor buffer in slow circles, and the fluorescent lights flicker, and the carousel hums, and nothing changes except that another day has passed, and everyone survived, and tomorrow they'll do it again. The light is still gray through the unwashed windows. The carpet is still worn. And somewhere, always, someone is waiting.